During their service life, British armored carriers picked up something of a reputation for toughness. From illustrious to victorious, these ships were routinely damaged by air attack of different varieties. HMS Formidable is, perhaps, the classic example of this, a ship that took a severe pounding in both the Mediterranean and Pacific, yet also a ship that served admirably in every major theater the Royal Navy fought in. Formidable certainly had an interesting service life, although one that mostly ended with the surrender of Japan. She would not see major service past that point for a variety of reasons. Before we get to that, however, the traditional design overview. Formidable was the second of the illustrious class carriers, which were designed to the limits imposed by the Second London Naval Treaty. This meant a 23,000-ton standard displacement, which from all indications was met, or at the least, the British came within a couple hundred tons of it. The fully loaded displacement was more like 28,000 tons, depending on the ship. On that displacement, Formidable carried 36 or so aircraft as initially designed, with the use of a deck park that rose to around 60, with 57 aircraft being the usual number cited. As for defensive firepower, Formidable carried 8 twin 4.5-inch gun mounts for a total of 16 barrels. These were mounted in sponsons along the side of the flight deck, with 4 on the bow and 4 on the stern, with their barrels able to elevate and fire over the deck for cross-deck fire as necessary. To support those, Formidable also carried 6 octuple-mounted 2-pounder pom-poms, coming out to 48 barrels. These would, in turn, be reinforced over the course of the war by a variety of 20mm cannon and 40mm Bofors. Now, armor protection. Formidable had a main belt of 4.5 inches in thickness. This thickness was maintained for the ends of the hangar as well. The main armored feature, however, was the deck. This was 3 inches thick and was the distinctive part of the illustrious design. These were the first proper armored carriers, although it was less of an armored flight deck and more of an armored box enclosing the hangar to protect the aircraft, fuel, and ordnance. And all of this could be pushed through the water at around 30.5 knots by 111,000 shaft horsepower through 3 shafts. With that done, let's look at the service history. The ship that would become HMS Formidable was laid down on June 17, 1937. She would then be launched on August 17, 1939. Although this did not go without issue. Formidable's wooden cradle collapsed, and the ship slid down the slipway on her own. Hobbs notes this as killing the wife of a shipyard worker and injuring several men. Other sources will typically give a number of 20 injured in addition to the wife. Apparently, the woman doing the christening ceremony managed to swing the traditional bottle against Formidable's bow as she rumbled down the slipway. Nice reflexes. In any event, this mess didn't damage the ship, which floated along as if nothing was out of the ordinary. This apparently got her labeled the ship that launched herself. A pretty interesting start to her career, to say the least. It would only get more exciting as time went on. For now, though, Formidable went through her fitting out process, commissioning into the Royal Navy on November 24, 1940. She outpaced her sister, Victorious, to become the second of the illustrious class to enter service. During the fitting out stage, Formidable received aircraft warning radar, making her an early adopter of that technology. That said, her initial service wouldn't put the radar to much use. Her first mission, ranging out into the Atlantic, involved hunting for the Panzerschiff Admiral Scheer. This mission began on December 18th and involved both searching for the raider and escorting convoys. The first mission proved a failure as Scheer evaded detection. The second part of the operation, however, was a success. Formidable escorted a convoy to Cape Town, South Africa. The convoy arrived on January 22, 1941. The carrier remained there for a few days before being reassigned to the Mediterranean. Illustrious had been heavily damaged by German air attack, so Formidable was sent to replace her sister ship. This would be a mostly uneventful voyage, if an admittedly long one. with the notable exception of bombing Italian holdings in Somalia in February 1941. After that was done, Formidable sailed up the Suez Canal, finally joining the Mediterranean fleet on March 10th, where the aircraft carrier was almost immediately thrown into action. First, on March 20th, Formidable helped escort a convoy to Malta. No major action during this. A week later is when the first excitement came for HMS Formidable. On March 27, 1941, the Italian fleet was spotted. They had set sail for convoy raiding, although broken codes alerted the Royal Navy to the movement. As a result, the Mediterranean fleet set sail, 3 battleships and HMS Formidable leading the way. By the next morning, March 28th, a scout from Formidable had found the Italian fleet. With this sighting, the two fleets sailed towards one another for the Battle of Cape Matapan, a battle that resulted in the worst defeat for the Italian Navy during the war. Formidable's role was to use her aircraft to try and weaken the Italian fleet, or at least slow it down. In this, Formidable's aircrew did their job well. In the afternoon of March 28th, one of her albacores managed to land a torpedo on the stern of Vittorio Veneto, at the cost of that aircraft, as the Italians shot it down right after it dropped the torpedo. Not that it made any difference, as the Italian battleship was temporarily brought to a halt, while heavy flooding broke out in the damaged area. This flooding is quite apparent when you look at pictures of it. It was not, however, crippling damage. They pulled out, even as another attack came from Formidable. These aircraft were intended to stop the battleship. Instead, the pilots ended up attacking the heavy cruiser Pola. This saw a torpedo slam into the cruiser and leave her adrift without main power. It was this strike that led to the crushing Italian defeat. Pola's sister ships, Zara and Fiume, were sent back with destroyer escort. They were assigned to assist Pola, but this only left them vulnerable in the gathering darkness. The British had spotted the Italians with radar, which allowed their battleships to sneak up on the unsuspecting cruisers, where Warspite, Valiant, and Barham proceeded to blast the Italians to pieces. However, Formidable was in the main battle line with the battleships during at least part of this, specifically third in the line, behind Warspite and Valiant, but ahead of Barham. This has resulted in a story cropping up that Formidable opened fire alongside the battleships and maybe managed to land a hit with her 4.5-inch guns, at which point she was promptly ordered to back away, which the carrier did as the rest of the battle progressed. In any case, with Matapan drawing to a close, Formidable returned to a quieter life. For a little while, anyway. Her next mission was supporting a bombardment of Tripoli on April 18, 1941. This saw an attack by Italian torpedo bombers that Formidable's Fulmar saw off. Then, come April 21st, the carrier's aircraft dropped flares to illuminate Tripoli for the bombardment force. Following this, the month of May began with providing escort for convoys, a fairly routine mission covering a run from Alexandria to Malta on May 6th through May 11th. However, during this process, Formidable's fighters would see serious attrition. By the time she returned to Egypt, the ship had almost no fighters left. This kept her from supporting the defense of Crete, with Formidable only returning to action on May 26th, which involved a raid on an Italian airbase at Scarpanto. This raid itself went well enough. The return to Egypt, on the other hand, went very poorly. Formidable was attacked by a formation of German Stukas, much as illustrious before her. 2 1,000-kilogram bombs hit the ship. This did, well, I think the pictures on screen show it pretty well. Formidable's bow was punched open, her hull was buckled, and the ship was generally beat up. Even so, she kept on sailing at around 20 knots and operating her aircraft. British armored carriers are, again, very tough ships. Still, while not crippling damage, and nowhere near the pounding Illustrious took, it was enough to pull Formidable from the line. She landed her air group at Alexandria and received emergency repairs. These lasted until June 1941, at which point the battered ship sailed for the United States. While still assisting ostensibly neutral, American shipyards were quite busy repairing British warships. Illustrious had been repaired in Norfolk Navy Yard, and Formidable was following that example. The carrier would remain in the United States until December 1941, where she joined Illustrious, fresh off her own repairs, to return home. Which should have been fine, but the two carriers collided on the way back. This did notable damage to Illustrious's flight deck, and some damage to Formidable's stern. It was enough to require more repairs in Belfast from late December to early February 1942. Upon the conclusion of that refit, Formidable set off for the Indian Ocean, the next step in her globe-trotting journey, and arguably the quietest one. Formidable arrived in Ceylon on March 24th, where she joined the Eastern Fleet. Only a few days later, the carrier was back at sea. The British had received intelligence indicating the Japanese were planning to attack the island. The commander of the Eastern Fleet, James Somerville, sent his heavy hitters to sea in preparation for that attack, which would become the Indian Ocean raid, and was also quite devastating. From April 5th to April 10th, the Japanese sank merchants at sea and raided Ceylon, while also hitting British warships. From the old Hermes to the cruisers Dorsetshire and Cornwall, they were all sent to the bottom. For their part, the British attempted to counter. However, in spite of spotting the Japanese fleet, this came to nothing. Formidable and her sister Indomitable failed to engage the rampaging Japanese. Considering the forces involved, this was probably a good thing for the British. The rest of her time with the Eastern Fleet would prove less eventful. Formidable spent much of her time in port or patrolling, with the exception of Operation Stab, a decoy operation towards the Andaman Islands in July 1942, which, in its own right, saw little in the way of actual action. Only a single Japanese floatplane was shot down by a Martlet, a British Wildcat, off Formidable. Soon after this, the carrier was sent back to Britain for a refit. She arrived back home, remaining there from September 21st through October 18th of 1942. At that point, Formidable was sent back to her old stomping ground in the Mediterranean to support the Operation Torch landings in early November. This was also fairly uneventful. Her aircraft would fly support missions and occasionally down German bombers. The most exciting moment was definitely the sinking of the surrendered U-331 on November 17, 1942. That submarine is most famous for the sinking of Formidable's old comrade, HMS Barham. With the conclusion of the Torch landings, the carrier returned to convoy defense, and interdiction of Axis convoys as well. This would see her sailing around the Mediterranean from December 1942 through to July of 1943, at which point Formidable supported another landing operation, this time Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. This began on July 9, 1943. Formidable's role would mostly revolve around watching for German or Italian aircraft and supporting the landings with airstrikes. Neither role saw much in the way of actual action, with the exception of an Italian torpedo bomber attack on July 15th. This hit HMS Indomitable, while Formidable avoided damage. She would continue to support landings and avoid any damage through to October of 1943, including the landings at Salerno in September. However, with the Italian armistice taking their fleet out of the war, Formidable would be detached in October. The ship returned to Britain and joined the home fleet. There isn't much to say about this period in her career, as Formidable spent early November escorting an Arctic convoy. Then it was back home and into a lengthy refit in January 1944. And by lengthy, I mean half of the year. Formidable would be in dock from January through May, and then her post-refit trials would last until June 1944, at which point she rejoined the home fleet for operations off Norway, specifically a series of raids on the battleship Tirpitz from July through August. Formidable joined HMS Furious and Indefatigable, although her own aircraft contributed relatively little, mostly because of foul weather, German smokescreens, or a combination of both. With the conclusion of the Tirpitz raids by September, Formidable was back in refit. Again. this time in Gibraltar, lasting from October through December. If you're keeping track, that means Formidable spent 9 months in 1944 either in refit or on post-refit trials. Her time in Gibraltar, for its part, was mostly focused on fixing up her machinery and augmenting the carrier's anti-aircraft battery, because Formidable was setting off for the British Pacific Fleet and her fight against the Japanese. The ship left Gibraltar in January 1945 on a long voyage east. Formidable would only arrive in Australia on March 10th, where the carrier joined the British Pacific Fleet. Formidable then set sail for the Philippines, and from there towards the Sakishima Islands on April 14th. She was replacing Illustrious again, as that ship needed a refit. As a result, Formidable joined the British Pacific Fleet on an operation to neutralize Japanese airfields in preparation for the landing on Okinawa. This initial operation saw no real issues on Formidable's end. A follow-up on May 4th would not go nearly as well. On that day, Formidable's infamous Kamikaze incident took place. An A6M0 dove out of the clouds as Formidable's crew moved some Avengers forward. They were caught completely off guard by this as the Zero strafed the flight deck around 11:30 in the morning. The pilot then turned his plane around and dove into the flight deck, despite quick action by Formidable's captain to turn the ship, and equally quick action by her gunners opening fire on the Zero. The plane slammed into the carrier. The aircraft's bomb didn't penetrate the deck, leaving a large dent. However, it did cause severe fires. Both aircraft and fuel were set ablaze as Formidable burned. However, the fire was put out fairly quickly, and the carrier was able to operate aircraft by that afternoon. Another Kamikaze on May 9th went almost the exact same way. It did little outright damage, but wrecked her aircraft and set a large fire. Then, on May 18th, a Corsair being loaded on the hangar deck accidentally fired its guns, which set yet another fire inside the ship this time. This burned out Formidable's flight group and finally sent the ship back to Australia for repair. She arrived on May 31st, 1945, where the damage was patched up. Not properly repaired, but patched up. Formidable then returned to battle, supporting operations off the Japanese coast for the remainder of the war. This would last from July of 1945 through August 12th. Formidable avoided any more damage, as the Japanese were largely spent by this point. In fact, they would surrender soon after the carrier left the area. The remainder of her active career, late 1945 through early 1947, was spent as a troop ferry, carrying both occupation troops and returning POWs. This role lasted until February 1947. Soon after that, in March, Formidable went in for a final short refit. By August, she was paid off into reserve. At this point, it was apparent that Formidable's series of fires, and the German bombing early on, had left its mark. The ship was completely worn out, and in no shape for further service, not without basically a new ship level of rebuild. As such, HMS Formidable would never return to service. The ship was sold for scrap in January 1953, where her story came to an end. An exciting one, to be sure, but one that could only end one way. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.